Welcome back, guys. So I finally started digging into this S7 rebuild on this salvage. And what I want to show you guys today is the actual turbo failure. So this is the main reason, or one of the main reasons, that this car was sold as a salvage unit rather than normal wholesale or retail. So if you see here, you can see that this has a lot of play on this impeller, and you can also see how that impeller has actually contacted the housing of the turbo. It's got the corners rolled up on the impeller, and this is a turbo failure. And Audi does have a fix for this. This is a known issue on Audis, and what is happening is the feed lines for the oil, which are right here on each turbo, these feed lines feed the bearing for the turbo, okay, that lubricate it when this is spinning, when the engine's running. And what's happening is debris is able to get into the turbo through that oil line. So what Audi has done is they have made a screen that will go beneath these two pressure lines down here. So after we get these bad turbos off, we'll be tearing into that, and we'll see where that screen is and how to replace that screen, or add that screen rather, and that'll keep debris from getting into our new turbos. Now, anytime you have a failure like this, you're always faced with the opportunity to upgrade, and that's what we're going to do with this S7. So what we're going to do is upgrade to this, which is an RS7 spec turbo. And this turbo is larger, as you can see. It also has a billet turbine wheel rather than the cast wheel that is on the stock S7. So when you buy these are just this is what's called a turbo cartridge. So the cartridge is this part here, and the cartridge has the turbine and the impeller as part of the unit. And because we've upgraded to a larger unit on the impeller side, we get new housings too, and these new housings will fit over top of this impeller and have the right amount of clearance, whereas these units here would have to be machined. If that's another route you can go, is machine these housings to make them fit the new impeller. So I'm going to keep going here. I'm going to get these off. I'll show you what that looks like. We're replacing a few other things in this car, and as we go along, I'll show you that as well. Okay guys, so I've got the turbos off of this S7, and the condition's actually worse than what I thought originally. So what you can see here on both these turbos is that the turbine wheel is actually missing on both. Okay, so normally the turbine wheel would sit here inside the exhaust housing, and that would actually turn the impeller on the other side of the turbo, and then that's what creates your boost. So these turbos failed so badly that the turbine likely seized, and while it was spinning at high speed, and typically that breaks the shaft that runs between the compressor wheel and the turbine. So if you look here, this is the replacement turbo, one of the replacement turbos. You can see this wheel right here is what's missing on these factory turbos. So this shaft that runs through the whole way through the turbo and has a nut on this end, and turning one side turns the other. So that shaft is actually broken due to poor lubrication. So again, these cars, they get dirt through the oil feed. The oil feed comes in the top of the turbo in the center here, and that's pressurized oil from the engine, and that feeds the bearing at the center of these turbos. and then it would drain out the bottom back into the sump of the engine. And on these cars, the way they're designed from the factory, debris gets in to the oil feed and gets in the bearings and causes them to wear out prematurely, causes the slop that we saw on the compressor side of this turbo with this wheel moving around. And yeah, it takes out the bearing, and worst case scenario, you can have that shaft seize up like these have and break off. And a lot of times when that happens, you also see the impeller will basically come completely loose as well, and it'll sit in this housing and tear it up pretty bad. So this one probably broke pretty recently, and then that's why this car went to salvage auction. So I'm going to get these apart and get the new turbos on, and we'll follow up from there. So I've got the new turbo cartridges set up, installed. These the new housings to go with the oversized compressor wheels. And here are the turbo cartridges that came out. So you can see this a little closer than before. So this one was actually tore up a little worse than the other side. So this one was leaking a lot of oil. So when the car was running, this is where most of the smoke was coming from. So I did look for this compressor wheel, or both compressor wheels, in the manifold housings, and I only found a small piece to one of them right here. That's all that was left in there. So the rest of it likely is in the exhaust system. So before running this car, I'm going to have to pull the mufflers and see if any of that's stuck in there. The exhaust on this car that somebody put on is pretty much straight through, so odds are most of it went out, but have to check. You don't want those pieces getting sucked back up into the engine and back up into the turbos, pretty much destroy them, do the same thing again. Here is the oil strainer. Now this is designed to prevent what had happened to these turbos. So this will go in the housing beneath the oil feed lines. There's a check valve, and the purpose of this check valve is to allow oil in this way, and then when you shut the engine off, this check valve will close, and that will hold oil pressure on the top side of this valve, and that will keep oil in the bearings for the turbos so that they're not dry on startup. So this sits in the housing like this, and then the screen's on top, and then these are the two oil feed lines that go into the top of the turbos, and I've flushed these out to make sure there's no debris stuck in these, and I'll be cleaning the housing as well where this stuff lives. So I'll go ahead and install these turbos and check back in. So before I put the turbos back on this, I wanted to give you guys a look at this engine with those off. It is a pretty cool engine. It's an awesome design. So what Audi's done, obviously, is put the turbos in the center of the engine together rather than on the outsides of the engine. So what's different here compared to a traditional V8 engine is that the intake manifold is actually on the outside of the cylinder head. So this has intake manifolds on both sides. You can see where the orange gasket goes to the intake manifold, and then there's a plenum that comes off the front of the turbos to feed both sides, and the exhaust actually runs through the center of the engine. And they've done this for a lot of reasons. Mainly, they talk about trying to keep most of the heat from the turbochargers centered in the engine, and also making it so that the engine's more compact, because having turbos hanging off the side of the engine can make it quite wide. Also here, you can see the design here as far as where this check valve goes. So this check valve actually sits in here like this. And then the screen here. And the housing goes on top of that. And these two ports here are the two that supply oil pressure to the turbos. And the screen seats in this housing. The two drain backs are here, and they drain back in the block through here, and that goes down into the sump. So you can see, I was looking at the old check valve, and you can see that this oil is very, very, very dirty and shows a lot of signs of debris from the turbos filling. So you can see there's quite a bit of metal in here from those bearings. So before I even start this engine after putting these new turbos on, I'm going to do the oil change. So you can see this is pretty sludged up. There's some pretty nasty looking stuff, and when you have a turbo failure, you know, this is something you can expect. So definitely going to be flushing this thing out a little bit. But there's a better look at how these things work. The design on this is a pretty cool engine.